There is something that could be happening, like where they give kids a different way to ask questions, like let them write it down on something, post it, have opportunities to get up, talk to a partner. These very tiny, tiny things. And then incrementally, you can build them up until you have so many more tools in your repertoire that create the kind of environment you want.
Hello there, and welcome to today's episode of the Easy EdTech podcast. My name is Monica Burns, and I am so glad that you're here to join me today. If you want to make the most of education technology, aka EdTech, well, you are in the right place. My goal has always been to help make EdTech easier and give you ideas you can try yourself, share with a colleague, or bookmark for later in the school year. Every Tuesday here on the Easy EdTech podcast, you'll hear stories from my time in the classroom, the work I do now with schools and districts, and my travels to different EdTech events. Get ready for solo episodes where I share some quick tips and stories, and interviews full of practical ideas and stories from new guests each month. If we mention something you'd like to check out, make sure to click the link. You'll find it in the episode description or the summary area where you're listening to this podcast, or you can find every episode and all of the resources we mention by going to classtechtips.com/podcast, or by going to classtechtips.com and just clicking on the Easy EdTech podcast button at the top of the page. This episode is sponsored by the blog at classtechtips.com. If you're looking for wintertime activities or ways to make connections between the season and what you're teaching, then head over to the blog page of classtechtips.com. You'll find a search bar where you can type in keywords like winter, Thanksgiving, or bulletin board ideas. You name it. So head over to classtechtips.com/blog and use the search bar to find over 1,000 blog posts and podcast episodes full of ideas to try. This week's episode is titled How Tiny Habits Can Transform Your Teaching, and I'm excited to have Miriam Plotinsky back on the podcast. She is a fellow ASCD author and has a new book on a topic I love, the power of embracing small shifts. I love conversations and resources that are super practical and make it easy to take action right away. If you are a productivity nerd like I am, or just looking for a few quick ideas to try that will pack a punch, then this episode is for you. Let's jump into the conversation. Welcome back to the podcast, Miriam. I'm so excited to chat with you today. And before we jump into today's topic, making small changes that produce big results, can you remind listeners about your role in education? What does your day-to-day look like?
Yes, so I have a really fun title. It's instructional specialist, and that often sounds vague. So what it means in my context is that I work for a large school district in Maryland, and I'm essentially an in-house support and partner for schools. And specifically right now, I'm in secondary English language arts and literacy. So I work with schools grades 6 to 12, really helping anyone from administration teams to teachers to students on whatever it is they need in that very, very large space of reading, writing, speaking, listening across all those domains. And so that's what I do by day. And then by night, I write a lot of things.
And wow, right? Just, that perspective of working with educators in so many roles, supporting students at all different grade levels and different things they're looking to accomplish, I'm sure has given you such perspective for your writing, which is what we're going to talk about today. And so, can you start off by telling us a bit about what inspired you to write your new book with ASCD, Small But Mighty, and how you identified this importance of small, everyday habits for educators?
So I was inspired both by sort of the theoretical and the practical. So I read a few books. One of them I talk about a lot because it's made a big difference in the way I look at how we organize our time. And it's called Brief, and it's by Joseph McCormick, who's not in education. He's an organizational management expert. And he just has all of these different ways of approaching the systems that we have across different organizations and questioning, why do we do these things? Why do we do meetings this way? Why do we do anything the way that we do it? And a lot of times it's because we've always done it a certain way and we don't bother to question it. So I really love his perspective, as well as, and I'm sure you've heard of Atomic Habits, the bestseller by James Clear. And so I started thinking about a long time ago how we could take some of these ideas, brevity, less is more, habit stacking, because in education, it seems like they are real lifesavers. And then just in terms of the practical, I observe a lot of classes. I go into a lot of classrooms and see instruction. And very often, any given class can go from good to great to whatever you want to call it, just with just a few really, really small tweaks. Like, for example, if a teacher's standing there and saying, any questions? And there's complete silence because that's a buzzkill. Yeah. There is something that could be happening, like where they give kids a different way to ask questions, like let them write it down on something, post it, have opportunities to get up, talk to a partner. These very tiny, tiny things. And then incrementally, you can build them up until you have so many more tools in your repertoire that create the kind of environment you want.
And, as you're talking, I was just thinking about what it means to make these small changes, right? The habit stacking, like you mentioned, or one of my favorite non-education books is The Compound Effect, right? Which talks about this same idea. So I love that you're translating these messages for educators who have so many opportunities throughout their day to make some small changes, right? That can scale, right? That can have this massive effect, even if it seems kind of tiny, in the moment. So, in your book, you emphasize that small changes can lead to those big rewards. You gave that great example of just reframing how you might ask a question. So can you share with us perhaps another way, another small habit teachers can adopt and the impact it might have in their classroom?
Absolutely. So almost any teacher I've ever met likes to frame learning. This is what skillful teachers do. We start class, we frame our learning, and we often do so with an activator. I prefer activators to warm-ups because warm-ups are not really connected to the course content. They have a time and place, but activators have that connection to whatever new learning kids are about to have. I think a really great tweak to any activator is evening the playing field when it comes to background knowledge. So the way that I think about this is if you have 30 kids in your classroom and 5 of them are talking all the time, they probably have the advantage of some sort of context that many of the quieter kids in the class don't. So I think about how can we use the activator to build that background knowledge, because I know that we like to activate it, but sometimes it's not there yet. So how can we create opportunities for kids to learn about something? So if I'm going to be reading an article about the Great Depression and I don't know anything about the Great Depression, what are some really interesting ways that we can connect what happened then, maybe to something that's happening now, and just build that interest for kids before they jump in and make the class just so much more engaging for them.
And what, it resonates so much for me with that example you just gave is that you're picking a moment that happens every day or almost every day. It happens in lots of different classrooms across different content areas. So not only can a teacher make that small shift in their everyday practice, but it can become part of a common conversation, right? Across grade levels, across different subject matters to say, like, this small thing made a difference in my classroom. And you can really take that into your ELA classroom, your math classroom, your social studies classroom. And I think there's a lot of power to those pieces that, as a classroom teacher, you might feel like you're on your own, like in your own world sometimes, right? But just that common thread to say, like, this small thing can have, a really massive impact. So, for listeners who are looking for an EdTech connection, or how can teachers use education technology to support some of the small but mighty habits you talk about in the book? Do you have any favorite tools or strategies that you recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot about how we have to be very discerning with the technology to make sure that kids are really getting the most out of it, because teachers really want kids to engage in critical thinking. And kids really want to get things done as quickly and efficiently as possible. And so these two things sometimes kind of, they're a little dissonant because, quick doesn't necessarily. So what I recommend is, if you are working on a project or an assignment, give kids the non-digital space first, where all the devices are closed, to let them brainstorm, let them talk, let them communicate, let them ask questions. I'm really a big believer in higher order thinking questions, making sure that kids actually create them as opposed to you, the teacher, always creating them. So do that work at the front end to show kids how, once they get into the technology space and they can use tools and make presentations or whatever it is, or even if they want to engage with, and I know this is very controversial right now, various AI tools, if they're available, they know what questions to ask. Like if they're using Gamma to build a presentation, they've done the thinking already. So they can tell Gamma sort of the shell of what they want, and then start asking it the right questions to produce a product that reflects their thinking, not the computer's thinking. So just really having that time ahead and then bringing in the technological piece.
Yeah, just really setting up everyone for success, right? I think is such a crucial piece there. I love that emphasis on let's have a conversation, let's ask really strong questions. And, it's interesting to hear you make that AI connection too, because I think a lot of people, I was literally an hour before our conversation today on a webinar, leading a webinar for a group of educators. That's one of the things that came up, was like, how do kids jump into a chatbot? Like, how do we set them up for success? And, it wasn't the focus of the webinar I was doing today, but it was something that came naturally right out of this conversation of exploring different chatbots. So, if we are looking for parallels for setting up kids for success in those spaces, it really is, carving out that time, modeling for students, and having that as part of the setup, if you will, right, of a lesson that might employ, right, some digital tools down the line. So, in your personal professional experience, things that you have in your workflow, or maybe things you've seen in other classrooms that you visited, is there one small habit, maybe something a little sneaky or surprising, right, that has had this ability to produce big results that a listener might not expect?
I'm a big believer in movement. And this is for teachers and for students. It's for humans. There's a lot of research about the brain to body connection and how we really, once, for example, 30 minutes of sitting still, your brain will need some time to process. And so what I do personally, and I have a chapter on well-being and belonging in this book as well, I always take a 5-minute loop around the building once a day, typically like in the middle of the day, just to reset. And that is a huge time saver, because at that point I'm overloaded and I can't think anymore. And so I can go back and get back into it. But for kids, any partner conversation they're going to have them get up, cross the room, and have that conversation with somebody else. And I know that we sometimes get concerned about management, but honestly, if they're sitting still, they're not engaged anymore for that long period of time. So for me, the most bang for your buck is to get them moving. And even if you want to process the conversation, have them stand still where they are and have the conversation with people still standing up. I just think it's a huge win.
And also, right, it does that just reset for students to say, like, we're now doing this different thing, or we're in this different physical space, and changing it up, sure, like physically their location in the space, but that also, right, you said, like, sends that signal to say, like, there's a pause point between this. Like, there is this moment to take a deep breath and then jump back into this other piece. And, it's interesting what you said about the going for a walk in the middle, right, of the day like that, like just to have that 5-minute loop. I was reading something recently and they were saying, like, anytime you have that, like, you have just that instinct to go to your scroll, right, to scroll through some social media, like, have your 4 things to choose from that are different, right? Maybe it's do a loop around the house, or maybe it's go and, like, change something and move it to another part of, right, your den, or whatever it might be, like, just having something to go to. And that's, that routine, like you said, I definitely understand, right, how someone might have the classroom management pause, right? But it becomes a routine that you do all the time, that it's not responsive, that it's proactive, right? It could be something that, becomes a regular practice with a group. So I love that one. And definitely, I think it falls into that unexpected or surprising category. So, for someone listening who is maybe in a classroom, working with students, maybe they're coaching other teachers, right, or leading a whole big group, like a whole school, how can school leaders support those teachers who are interested in making small changes, especially if they're feeling like a time crunch or a resource crunch? Is there something they can do to help them with making small changes throughout the school week and the school year?
I think the big thing is listening to what people have to say when they're asking for help. One thing that we see a lot from school leaders, and I've wrote another book about this, is setting priorities for teachers and then expecting them to buy into those priorities and for whatever so, if you decide the whole school is going to work on improving discourse, student-to-student discourse, that's a great goal. But is everyone on board? Did you decide this with them or without them? Have people expressed other needs? And so one small, and very often teachers will say, I need, and they'll, fill in the blank. And one thing that leaders can do is just think about, okay, what are the resources that I have in this building right now? It is a small thing. It costs no money, but it involves knowing your people. So if there is a teacher who's saying, I have students of so many varied abilities in my classroom, and I just need help with differentiation, which is not a just, that's a huge, huge ask. But there are teachers in the building who have done that successfully and who can be partnered with them to coach them or help them. So it's about leveraging what you have, not necessarily looking for it somewhere else. And also, again, making sure that when someone says, I need something, you're not saying to them, oh, but actually you need something else.
Yeah.
Even if it's true. Because there's times and places, and if people are reaching out, we listen to them.
Right, where they're reaching out, they're naming the thing that they need help with, right? It might lead to a conversation down the line for something else, right? But in that moment, really honoring that request and leveraging those resources that are already present is a great recommendation for school leaders who understand the importance, right, of making changes, right, and can acknowledge that sometimes it starts with these small moments that don't necessarily need, extra things. There might be something there, right, that they can leverage already. So, I mentioned your new book, Miriam, Small But Mighty, from ASCD. And for those who are interested in learning more about the book, where can they go to find it? Is there something else in the book you want to give a shout out to that listeners should know about?
What excites me about this book is that it's really focused on tools and strategies. So it's broken up into essentially the components of instruction: before instruction, during instruction, after instruction, and then well-being and belonging. So, before instruction includes the planning cycle, and then during is what happens in your classroom, and then how do we reflect? And for each of those components, there's tools and ideas. And I'm also really excited about the fact that in that well-being and belonging section, I've got two really amazing SEL experts, Phyllis Fagel and Alex Chevron-Venet, who really contributed a lot of ideas to how we help students cope with the anxiety they have and how we help teachers do the same thing, because it's been a bumpy few years in education, and so I feel like those are topics that we need to address openly. So I would definitely point people toward those parts, whatever they feel they need to grow in, whatever chapters they need to grow in. And then I'm easy to find. I have a website that is my first and last name.com, and of course all the socials.
Perfect. Well, I will link out to all of that so that everyone can find you, they can connect with you, they can grab a copy of the new book. And as you mentioned, I love resources that are practical, that are ready for someone to take action on. And the way that you've organized this content, that you've broken down big things into smaller moments for people to tackle, I think is a really powerful thing, particularly in this time in education. So, Miriam, thank you for your time, for coming back to the podcast, and for sharing some great ideas with listeners.
Thank you for having me.
It was such a treat having Miriam back on the podcast, and I know you're going to love her new book. So let's make this EdTech easy with a few key points from today's episode. Small, incremental changes in daily teaching routines can lead to a big impact. Technology tools should be introduced thoughtfully. Incorporating movement and encouraging physical activity can re-engage students. School leaders should prioritize listening to teachers' needs and leverage in-house resources. Remember, you can find the show notes from today's web episode and all of the ways to connect with Miriam by heading to classtechtips.com/podcast and finding today's episode. This one is number 294. This episode is sponsored by the blog at classtechtips.com. If you're looking for wintertime activities or ways to make connections between the season and what you're teaching, then head over to the blog page of classtechtips.com. You'll find a search bar where you can type in keywords like winter, Thanksgiving, or bulletin board ideas. You name it. So head over to classtechtips.com/blog and use the search bar to find over 1,000 blog posts and podcast episodes full of ideas to try. Thank you for listening to this new episode of the Easy EdTech podcast. I love creating new episodes for you each week, but I could use a bit of help spreading the word about the podcast. Can you leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app? Spotify will let you tap on the stars, and Apple Podcasts will let you tap on the stars and leave a 1 or 2 sentence review. Thank you so much for taking this extra step. It helps other educators find episodes like this one when they're searching for EdTech tips.